Hello. Today I'm going to go over how to read certain things from patterns and some tips I have dealing with patterns and, how I handle them at least. Some of my tips may not be for everyone, but this is what I do whenever I cut out patterns. Anyway, so the first thing you should make sure you know when dealing with a pattern is what pieces you actually need to cut out. Now, this is a simplicity pattern for a bag and some pants and a shirt, which I'm going to make both things for. The pants and the shirt are part of a costume, and the bag is, I just want to use my super cute red fabric over here. Anyway, so in most patterns, you will find something that shows you the different pieces, and it labels them, as you can see right there. Now, in the different views that you have, is what they show you here. It's basically all the things you can possibly make. Now, for this pattern, it's kind of obvious what you'll be using, but for more complicated patterns, they will kind of tell you, piece, whatever deals with whatever. But to make doubly sure you know what's going on the pattern piece itself, it'll tell you things like, what's the front of the pant? What is the back of the pant? The front of the top. And sometimes it'll even tell you what view it's related to, if it's a more complicated pattern. This one's not, so there's only one pair of pants. The main difference is, how long it is. Now, something I keep in mind when I cut patterns, as you will notice on here, that this is folded. I cut a multi-size pattern to the largest size, and then I basically fold it to the size that I need. I do this because what if I need to use this pattern at a different size? I don't know. I think this extends the life of my patterns because I made the mistake of, when I first started, just cutting it to the pattern size I needed, which is usually the smallest one, and then being like, oh, I wanted to make this for somebody else. Oh, it's too small now, So that's something to try to avoid. One thing you got to make sure to do, especially if you have to cut out two of something, is to fold your fabric. So you can see there are two layers here, because I need two pant fronts. That's kind of common sense, but I seriously just laid out a piece of fabric and recut it a couple times the first time I cut out stuff from a pattern, so try to avoid that. It also makes it so that your pattern pieces are more symmetrical because you're cutting them out at the same time. Anyway, on a lot of pattern instructions, there's a lot of stuff. They will suggest cutting layouts, which is, how to arrange your pattern pieces to maximize the amount of area. I never end up using these, simply because, I don't know, I just never end up using them. Maybe I end up, with more fabric scraps that way. If you're worried that you don't have enough fabric, then, you've got more issues than that. Honestly, you should always buy a little more fabric than you need, especially when you start out, like I said, about a half a yard more than you think you'll need. And in fact, let's look at the back of the envelope. On the back of most pattern envelopes, it will give you different measurements. Oh, that's not in focus. But anyway, it will give you different measurements about how much yardage for different parts based upon what size the pattern is. So say, size 10 patterns is what I tend to use for myself. It'll say, for a size 10 pattern, you need 3/4 of a yard for, this top or something like that. That is, kind of a standard thing. That way, before you even buy a pattern, you can know how much fabric to buy to go with it. It tends to be pretty helpful. But like I said, if it's something that's particularly, involves a lot of fabric, like a dress or something like that, give yourself about an extra half a yard. Same with a coat. You can be a little closer with other types of clothing, but, just if you're worried, give yourself a lot of margin of error, because then you can make mistakes. Another thing that most patterns, they will tell you, they will give you kind of a key on what the symbols are, but, what if you don't know what the words they're talking about mean? So, I'm going to go into that. So, the grain line is basically, in most woven fabrics it should be fairly obvious. You'll notice little lines running along the fabric, and that kind of goes with the weave of the fabric. If a fabric specifies, like it shows you on this bag pattern, these arrows tell you where the grain line should go. Now, most woven fabric have two grain lines. They have a grain line that goes this way, and a grain line that goes that way. But some fabrics, like stretch fabrics, only have one grain line. This is a stretch fabric. It stretches in the sideways direction, so the grain line goes like this. So if I were to make this bag out of this fabric would have to have its grain facing up and down this way, because that's what the arrow on this tells you. And this is very important because in the case of stretch fabrics, you want it to stretch in the proper way. Like, for instance, with this pair of pants, you want it to stretch in the seat so that when you sit down, the seams don't break, or things like that. So it's comfortable. If I did it the other way around, it wouldn't stretch properly, and it probably wouldn't lay properly, and it would just be kind of a mess. So that's one thing. So the ones that say place solid line on fold of fabric. So that, let's see, do I have a pattern with that? Alright. Let's just pretend it's got arrows here. If you see on the edge of a fabric there are two arrows, that's where the fold of your fabric should be. This is what is used typically in like, for instance, aprons. A lot of the time we'll do that. My apron pattern had that a lot. When you need kind of a long continuous piece in the front, but it's easier to just cut it so that you're using kind of symmetrical mirror images that way. Again, it's part of, just making it easier to be symmetrical. So that's kind of generally the idea of why they do that. Okay, notches. Notches are kind of important. Notches, they help you to line up pieces with each other when you're sewing them. This pants pattern, if you notice, there is a different notch position for each size. Pay attention to that. Because make sure it's the notch that's on the line, the farthest line of where you're using it. But anyway, notches help you line up fabric. What you do is you just cut a little spot in the area here. This is your seam allowance. So you cut a notch in the seam allowance, and then whenever you assemble the parts, it should line up with, like, notches on different pieces will line up with notches on other pieces, and that kind of generally tells you if you're putting it together right. Sometimes they may not line up perfectly if you end up taking taking your garment and draping it. So, anyway, notches are important. When you're sewing something that's curved, you tend to put in extra notches because you want the curve line to be nice and solid. Like, for instance, with this bag, right along here, I would cut a lot of notches before I sewed it. The lining and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm going to have to continue this in another video, so I will be right back.